Welcome back to the program. We have, what are we describing Hannah Webb Howard as now? She is a UALR law student and a freelance radio host now. Hannah, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? It's good to be with you.
I'm doing good. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for, giving me a little time off on vacation and hosting and doing a fantastic job as well. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. You know, it was fun and it was a great time and I had a good time, but I think I like being on this side this morning. Much
Okay.
less pressure.
Okay, so things are back to normal, if you will. But so how was it though? I mean, how did you how did you prepare, and was it what you expected? And I mean, because you did a great job. You sounded terrific.
Well, thank you very much. So, and I'm sure you remember this, it's been almost exactly 2 years since I made my radio show debut, if you will, on your show.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been almost exactly 2 years. That was my senior year of college. And that was the first time I ever had any type of exposure to any kind of media platform at all. And you had me on the show several times after that. And very, very quickly I realized that I really like this thing. And you can call it public speaking, I guess. You know, of course they can't see my face. But I learned to love public speaking, and I really started to grow over these last 2 years in it. And it's frankly all been because Conduit took an interest in me as a young person with a voice, and then helped foster that skill, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I completely credit Conduit with taking interest in the young population and then actually following through with that. And so I think, you know, maybe even be able to host is the direct result of that. But preparing for it was really interesting, and I got to meet a lot of interesting people because, of course, I had Senator Bozeman on the show, and then I got to have Conduit's own David Ferguson, and I got to check in with Dan Sullivan.
David won't even come on with me, so I'm very envious. David just
yes, I felt very honored.
Go ahead.
I did, and so preparing for this, you know, I got to have several conversations off the record with these people, you know, introducing myself, talking about the show, and everyone was incredibly welcoming and generous to the idea of, hey, I've never done this before, bear with me, we're going to get through it. And everyone was completely open to that and excited and almost honored, you know, to be my first guest, especially Senator Bozeman. You know, everyone, I had never interacted with him before the show. And, you know, everyone told me leading up to it, oh, he's, you know, very nice, very generous. You know, he's going to be nothing but gracious, and he truly was. You know, we got to have a little bit of a conversation before and after. And that's nice just as a normal constituent that he represents. Like, hey, this guy is a good, solid dude, and he was very generous and very gracious and understanding and, you know, was willing to talk to me as long as I needed to talk to him and come on the show and make sure that it was great for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was it was a really interesting side to it all. And, of course, you know, you were talking about you had to research in between the show to fact-check yourself. That was interesting because you can't – preparing for the show, I couldn't just get a quick, oh, here's the headline, okay, so-and-so, I believe that. You know, I actually had to dig into the facts. I had to, you know, go to this site and really figure out what happened with each topic that I was going to talk about, which was cool because I got to learn more, but it's a whole new respect for what you do, Paul.
Well, that when I got into this 10 years ago, I did have that gut check moment where I was like, wait a second, I'm going to be communicating to people, and so I've got to make sure that what I report on is, you know, somewhat accurate. I mean, sometimes the facts change, but that can be kind of unnerving. And by the way, Senator Bozeman is a real thoughtful guy, and so I'm really glad that you guys were able to connect and make that happen. I listened to your small business spotlight that you did, which I thought was really, really interesting. His story. I'm talking about the concrete, the gentleman. His name escapes me right now, but that was really good, and to hear him understand what happens when you have maybe liberals in office that make the economy bad. You just got to hold on until something better happens.
Absolutely. So that was Hicks Smith.
Yes.
And so what's interesting about that interview is, of course, my dad owns a small business and has since, not my entire life, but majority of my seemingly adult life. And so everything that he described, you know, it's a family business. And so I've gone through that on my end, observing, my dad. I remember the start of his business and, to where we are now, on the flip side where hopefully he can retire in a few years. And so I have that interesting perspective as a child going through all that and seeing your family grow and struggle and the successes and the bad times. I've seen it all. And so it was really interesting for me to get to kind of manifest that understanding with him and to talk to somebody even beyond what my dad has experienced during his small business. And now I'm at a time in my life where I'm not necessarily going to start a small business, but several of my friends are in my generation is. And so it was interesting to kind of be that voice between almost somebody who has all this experience that was incredibly successful, and then having my perspective and then being able to relay that to everyone, but specifically people my age with, this is how we can do it. And this is the time to do it. We don't have to deal with all the regulations that he did during that period. And so my generation, that's graduating college or didn't go to college and have this opportunity to start a trade, now's the time to do it. And here are these people we can look to as an example of that. So it was really interesting how that all got to piece together for me.
Yeah. And, and that it's a story that is so similar with business owners everywhere. And yet, the government tends to treat business owners as just sometimes they just don't think like business owners. And then they come back to them, ask for more taxes, and the politicians are going to be fine. They're going to be okay, but it's the business owners that are actually having to, run their businesses, provide jobs for employees, provide for their families in what can be a whirlwind of unpredictability. If you've got some politician in it that's going to spend too much money and require future tax increases or whatever the case may be, they truly are the backbone. Now we're talking with Hannah Webb Howard. She is a UALR law student. She guest hosted the program while I was on vacation for 2 days. And Hannah, your other interview with your cousin, tell us about that. That was really fascinating to hear him articulate just how liberal the Northeast can be, how liberal his high school experience was.
Right. So that interview was incredibly interesting for me because I knew Andrew was a smart dude and that he could articulate himself well, but I had no idea that he was going to be so good at this. So he truly blew me away. He was a natural. So me and Andrew, we are related. We're cousins. And for whatever reason, we didn't meet until we were both in college. And we actually met at Thanksgiving. Of all places to meet your cousin when you're 18, we were at Thanksgiving. But it was great. And we hit it off. And, of course, you're never supposed to talk about politics at Thanksgiving. Well, my family does not do that, mainly because we all agree. And so we can talk about it openly. And so, truly, when I said I think our first conversation was about Trump, I mean it. I think so. Maybe the only thing we talked about all day was politics. And it was so cool for me to find somebody my age from a different part of the country who I could sit here and have the same meaningful conversations and agreed with me. And so, his whole story's cool, of course.
Yes.
And the way that my high school experience wasn't like that. I mean, I genuinely had a neutral experience, and that's probably because of where we live. And everyone does typically agree with each other in Northeast Arkansas. And that's not true, of course, across the board, but as a general matter. And so I didn't experience any of that. And frankly, now that I'm an adult and look back, my high school history teacher, who I credit to teaching me everything I know about history, she was wonderful. She is apparently very liberal, but she never imposed that on us. And, she taught us U.S. history and world history. She never imposed it on us, and I never had any clue that she felt that way until I was an adult. And so my high school experience and his high school experience were totally different. Mm-hmm. But our college experiences were also, because it was in college that I was introduced to the very liberal agenda, if you will, and his wasn't. And so it's interesting how we had exact opposite experiences, but have turned out the same way in our young adult life. So it was really cool to get to talk to him, mainly because he was such a good guest, but to really flesh out how different our stories were, but how we all ended up the same.
So let me ask you this, Hannah, as this was one part of the interview that I kind of Well, it's just a question on the generation the generation. So where do you guys fall? You said we tiptoe around being a millennial or being Generation Z. What can you kind of expand on that? Like, what do you mean by that?
So there's various studies, and I actually think me and Joe researched this one day, trying to figure out what are we? Are we millennials? Or are we Generation Z? And it really just depends on the study that of where you fall. So I was born in 1995, and a lot of people will say, 90s to 2000s, they're still millennials, but some people will say 95 and up, you're Generation Z. And so I fall somewhere in the middle. I think that I'm probably just my experience, I'm probably considered more of a millennial. I think Generation Z, I think that what people call Generation Z, I would look at and think that they were little kids.
Yeah.
And so personally, I think I'll probably fall in the millennial range. But the thing with that is, of course, the millennials have been labeled the crazy pink hair liberals.
Mm-hmm.
But Generation Z, according to some studies, and I can't quote what study it is, that generation may be more socially liberal, but they're more economically conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And I will agree with that in my experience, just with my peers. And not that my peers are socially liberal. When I say peers, the people I agree with. And not that they're socially liberal, but just that they think, I don't think the government should tell me to do this. I don't think the government should tell me who I can marry and who I can't. But they're much more economically conservative. And of course, that's not across the board. That's just kind of the change I see in people who don't identify themselves as liberals, but they don't necessarily identify themselves as, maybe as hardcore conservative as we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just kind of looking at this. The reason I asked is because I'm fascinated with Generation Z. There are people, now you can't find it everywhere, but Generation Z appears to be rejecting the PC culture that millennials have embraced. And they are making millennials, social justice warrior millennials, really angry because Generation Z, they are just starting to tell jokes and be funny, and they really are embracing freedom of speech in a lot of ways. And they're doing this on these, they're different apps. I mean, apps that I don't use and haven't heard of. And then you've got all these influencers and these kids or whatever that are making all this money, but they seem to be embracing freedom of speech more so in the traditional American sense than the millennials who are always offended at the slightest thing. And so I have been following this phenomenon because I think it is one that kind of gives us hope that there are people where now kind of saying what you want to say is now becoming the counterculture. And that's, I think, a positive considering how sensitive the people who are going into positions of power now are, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
I completely agree. And I think it's part of, the system correcting itself as the pendulum swings, or however you want to phrase that.
Yeah.
But I do agree with you. I think that we're seeing more of a shift because, of course, I still keep up with I'd like to think that I'm still up to date with the cool social media things. I don't know. You really do go downhill when you graduate college. But I would like to think I'm still...
You're in law school, so you're doing a lot of studying. You don't have time for all of this pop culture.
Exactly. So, I like to think that I still keep up with it. And so I do agree that it seems to be shifting. Because, we got to a point in time where you couldn't even make a joke. And, you do meme of the day, and memes are, a phenomenon in my generation. And you couldn't even, have a meme out there that was even remotely funny if it offended any one person, even though the person doesn't mean the joke offensively. Of course somebody's going to be like, oh, you can't post that, you bigot, yada, yada, yada. And so I think that's what got really intense for a long period of time. And I do agree with you that it has, started to slack off maybe a little bit, or maybe people have been a little more like, okay, it's just a joke. No one is discriminating against anyone here. It's just a joke. We're just being funny. Let's laugh. Let's move on with our lives because it's not that big of a deal.
Hannah Webb Howard, UALR student, and freelance talk radio host. Hey, thank you so much for being with us this morning. We really appreciate it. And again, thank you for filling in for me while I was gone.
Well, absolutely. I'm happy to do so. Thanks for having me, Paul.
All right. Have a great day, Hannah. Folks, we're going to take a break and a reset, and we'll be back here in just a moment.